There's this shot in Season 9, sometime after Rick's gone, where the camera lingers on Carl's hat, sitting on the porch in Alexandria. Just sitting there, empty. Nobody's wearing it. Nobody's even looking at it. It's just an object now, gathering dust, catching sunlight, and I remember when that hat meant everything. When Carl wore it, it was Rick's legacy, Rick's past as a sheriff, Rick's hope that his son could grow up to be something better than the apocalypse demanded. And when Carl gave it to Judith before he died, it was supposed to mean something, a passing of the torch, a symbol that Carl's vision, his hope, his plea for peace would continue through his sister. But there it sits, empty, and nobody remembers. And I keep thinking, what if Carl's death meant nothing? Not because it was badly written or because we didn't care, but because meaning requires follow-through, requires someone to remember, to honor, to keep the promise alive. And The Walking Dead, maybe it couldn't, or wouldn't, or didn't know how. So tonight, let's trace something uncomfortable. Deaths that were supposed to matter but didn't. Deaths that asked for change and got forgotten. Deaths that became empty symbols, like that hat. Settle in. This one's about promises the story couldn't keep, and what that says about grief, memory, and what it means to die for nothing. Carl Grimes dies in Season 8, Episode 9, Honor, and the show frames it as the most important death in the entire series. Carl's been bitten helping Siddiq, a stranger Carl's trying to bring into the community, because Carl believes in helping people, in maintaining humanity, in being better than the apocalypse. And Carl knows he's dying, knows he has maybe hours, and Carl spends those hours writing letters. Letters to Rick, to Michonne, to Negan. Letters asking them to make peace, to stop the war, to honor what makes life worth living beyond just survival. And Carl's letter to Rick is explicit. Carl says something like, "It can't be all about killing. There's got to be something after." Carl's asking Rick to prove that survival can mean more than violence. That the war with Negan, the cycle of brutality, it can end. That Rick can choose hope over revenge, peace over pragmatism, humanity over the monster Rick's become. And the show frames Carl's death as transformative. The music swells. Andrew Lincoln and Chandler Riggs both deliver devastating performances. The camera lingers on Carl's face, on Rick's grief, on Michonne's tears. The episode's titled Honor, as in honor Carl's vision, honor what Carl died believing. And the narrative structure, the way Season 8's back half plays out, it all suggests Carl's death is the catalyst. The thing that'll finally break the cycle, end the war, transform the show from a series about violence into something about hope. And initially, it works. Season 8's finale, Wrath. Rick has Negan beaten, has a knife to Negan's throat, can kill the man who killed Glenn and Abraham and terrorized Rick's people. And Rick stops. Rick slits Negan's throat but doesn't kill him, saves him, imprisons him instead. Rick chooses mercy over execution, and Rick does it because Carl asked him to. Because Carl's letters said, "Make peace, Dad. Please, prove that we're more than killers." And Rick honors that. Rick creates peace, ends the war, starts trying to unite the communities in a way that honors Carl's vision instead of Shane's brutality. And Season 9 shows Rick trying. Rick's building the bridge, literally and metaphorically. Rick's trying to unite Alexandria, Hilltop, the kingdom, the sanctuary. Rick's trying to create the future Carl believed in. A future where communities cooperate instead of fight. Where hope matters more than fear. Where Carl's death wasn't meaningless. The emotional anchor is that Carl's death was supposed to redefine the show, shift its entire moral compass, transform it from a series about survival through violence into a series about survival through humanity. And the show commits to that, at least initially. Rick's entire Season 9 arc, before Rick disappears, is about honoring Carl. Rick carries Carl's letters. Rick quotes Carl. Rick makes decisions based on what Carl would have wanted. And Rick sacrifices himself on the bridge at the end of Season 9, Episode 5. And that sacrifice, that willingness to die to save the communities, that's Carl's philosophy. That's Rick finally becoming the man Carl asked him to be. Selfless, hopeful, willing to choose peace even when it costs everything. But here's the question that keeps me awake. Did Carl's death actually change anything long-term? Because yes, it changed Rick. It transformed Rick's arc for a year and a half. But Rick leaves in Season 9, Episode 5. Rick's taken by the CRM, disappears from the show. And with Rick gone, is Carl's vision gone too? Does Carl's death only matter as long as Rick's there to carry it? And if so, what does that say about whether Carl's death meant anything? Because meaning that depends on one person, meaning that evaporates when that person leaves, is that real meaning? Or is that just Rick's personal grief? And once Rick's gone, once Rick's not there to remember Carl, to honor Carl, to make decisions based on Carl's letters, does Carl's death stop mattering to the story? And I think the answer, uncomfortably, is yes. Carl died for nothing. Not because his death didn't matter to Rick, but because the show couldn't sustain Carl's vision without Rick. And once Rick was gone, Carl's meaning evaporated. And the hat sits empty. And nobody remembers. And maybe that's the horror. Not that Carl died, but that Carl died asking for something the show couldn't give him. And the show just moved on. And Carl became another name on a long list of the dead. And his vision, his hope, his belief that people could be better, it died with him, or it died with Rick. And either way, it's gone. And what was the point? Season 9 is complicated because Rick's trying so hard to honor Carl. The bridge, Rick's building, it's not just infrastructure. It's symbolic. It's communities, literally connecting, working together, building something that benefits everyone. That's Carl's vision. That's what Carl meant when Carl asked Rick to prove there's something after the killing, and Rick's doing it. Rick's sacrificing Alexandria's resources, spending time and energy and people to build this bridge that mostly benefits the sanctuary, Negan's former community. And Rick's doing it because it's the right thing to do, because Carl would have wanted it, because building bridges, literal and metaphorical, is how you honor a kid who died asking for peace. And it's working, kind of. Season 9, before Rick leaves, shows fragile peace. The communities are trading, communicating, cooperating. There's tension. Maggie's furious Rick spared Negan. Daryl's conflicted about whether peace is sustainable. Oceanside's skeptical, but there's cooperation. There's an attempt. Rick's holding it together through sheer force of will and constant reference to Carl. Rick keeps saying things like, Carl wanted this, or we're doing this for Carl, or Carl believed we could be better. Rick's making Carl's death mean something by refusing to let anyone forget it. By constantly invoking Carl's name, Carl's letters, Carl's hope. And as long as Rick's there, as long as Rick's the leader making decisions, and those decisions are explicitly tied to Carl's vision, Carl's death matters. Carl's death is the reason for the bridge, for the peace, for the attempt at cooperation. But then Rick leaves. Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After? Rick's injured, impaled on rebar, and there's a walker horde heading toward the communities. And Rick blows the bridge, sacrifices himself, nearly dies, gets taken by the CRM, and Rick's gone. And with Rick gone, who's carrying Carl's vision? Who's making decisions based on Carl's letters? Who's even mentioning Carl? And here's where it gets uncomfortable. After Rick leaves, Carl's barely mentioned. Season 9's back half, Seasons 10 and 11, the show moves on. New leaders emerge: Daryl, Carol, Maggie, Michonne, until she leaves too. New conflicts arise: the Whisperers, the Reapers, the Commonwealth, and those conflicts are solved through violence, through warfare, through killing Alpha and Beta, through fighting Lance Hornsby and Pamela Milton, not through Carl's vision of peace and cooperation, through Rick's pre-Carl methods of brutal pragmatism and superior violence. And Carl's name comes up occasionally, Michonne mentions him, Judith remembers him, but Carl's philosophy, Carl's vision, Carl's dying wish that the killings stop and something better emerge, that's gone. The show's back to what it was before Carl died. Cycles of violence, villain arcs, communities fighting for survival. And Carl's death, which was supposed to break that cycle, it didn't. It paused it for a year while Rick was around, and then the cycle resumed. The evidence is in the structure. Season 8 ends with peace. Season 9, while Rick's there, maintains fragile peace. Season 9, after Rick leaves, introduces the Whisperers, a villain group that requires warfare to defeat. Season 10 is the Whisperer War. Season 11 is the Commonwealth conflict. The show returns to its fundamental structure: introduce villain, fight villain, defeat villain, introduce new villain within one season of Rick leaving. And that structure, that cycle, it's antithetical to Carl's vision. Carl asked for peace. The show gave one season of peace, then went back to war. And Carl's death, which was supposed to end the cycle, just paused it. And once Rick was gone, once the person most invested in honoring Carl's vision was gone, the show abandoned it. The pattern is that The Walking Dead often drops arcs when actors leave. Lori dies, Rick grieves for a season, then moves on. Glenn dies. Maggie grieves and seeks revenge for a few seasons. Then her arc becomes about other things. And Carl dies. Rick honors Carl's vision while Rick's on the show, and then Rick leaves and Carl's vision dies with Rick's departure. And maybe that's realistic. Maybe that's how grief works intensely at first, fading over time, eventually becoming a memory that doesn't dictate behavior. But it also means Carl's death didn't fundamentally change the show. It changed Rick. But the show, the larger narrative, the structure and themes and direction of The Walking Dead, that stayed the same. Violence, survival, cycles of conflict. Carl asked for something different. The show couldn't or wouldn't give it to him, and Carl's death becomes just another death. Sad, impactful for the characters who loved him, but ultimately not transformative, not meaningful in the way the show promised it would be. Here's what haunts me. Carl's meaning lasted as long as Rick stayed, then evaporated. And if meaning is that contingent, that dependent on one person remembering and honoring, then is it real meaning, or is it just personal grief? Because to Rick, Carl's death means everything, changes everything, defines Rick's choices for the rest of Rick's time on the show. But to the show, to the larger narrative, Carl's death is just a plot point, a catalyst for Rick's arc. And once Rick's arc is over, once Rick's gone, Carl's death stops mattering to the story, and the hat sits on the porch, empty, a symbol of nothing. Because symbols only mean what living people make them mean, and when those people are gone, or when they stop caring, the symbol becomes just an object, and Carl's death becomes just a death. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that Carl died, but that Carl died believing his death would matter, would change things, would make the world better, and it didn't. It changed Rick's world. But Rick's world isn't the whole world, and the show's world, the larger Walking Dead universe, it just kept going, kept cycling through violence, kept being what it always was. And Carl's plea for something different, it echoed for a season and then faded, and now it's gone. And I don't know if that's honest or tragic. Maybe both. Maybe it's honestly tragic. That most deaths don't change anything. That meaning is fragile and temporary. That even the deaths that should matter, that are framed as mattering, often don't. Not because we don't care, but because the world is too big and too relentless to pause for anyone's death, no matter how much we loved them. And that's The Walking Dead. That's life. That's the empty hat on the porch, and maybe recognizing that is all we can do. After Rick leaves in Season 9, Episode 5, the show immediately starts moving away from Carl's vision. And it's not subtle. The Whisperers are introduced in Season 9's mid-season premiere, Episode 6. Alpha and Beta and the walker skin-wearing survivors who live among the dead and reject civilization entirely. And the Whisperers are the opposite of Carl's hope. Carl believed in community, in helping strangers, in building something better than survival. The Whisperers reject all of that. They're anti-community, anti-civilization, anti-hope. They're pure survival, pure animal existence, pure rejection of everything Carl died believing in. And the show frames them as the next major threat, the thing the communities have to defeat, and defeating them requires war. Season 10 is the Whisperer War. It's not negotiation. It's not peace. It's not finding common ground or honoring humanity. It's warfare. It's Daryl and Carol and Michonne and everyone else fighting Alpha and Beta. It's communities banding together not to build bridges but to kill threats. And they win. Eventually, Alpha dies. Beta dies. The Whisperers are defeated. But the method is violence. The same violence Carl asked the show to move beyond. And Carl's name barely comes up during this arc. Judith mentions Carl occasionally. Michonne references him before she leaves. But Carl's philosophy, Carl's letters asking for peace and cooperation, they're not guiding anyone's decisions. The communities are making pragmatic, violent choices. Shane's choices. Pre-Carl Rick's choices. And Carl's vision is nowhere. And then Season 11, the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth represents another chance to honor Carl's vision. Because the Commonwealth is 50,000 people living in a functioning society. They have government, infrastructure, jobs, trade. It's the closest thing to pre-outbreak civilization anyone's seen in over a decade, and Carl would have loved it. Carl would have seen it as proof that his hope was justified, that communities can rebuild, that there's something after the killing. But the show doesn't frame it that way. The show frames the Commonwealth as flawed, corrupt, oppressive, as something that needs to be changed or destroyed. And the protagonists, Daryl, Carol, Maggie, others, they instigate rebellion. They fight the Commonwealth's leadership. They use violence to overthrow Pamela Milton. And yeah, the Commonwealth is corrupt. Pamela's authoritarian. The class system is unjust. But the method of addressing those flaws is violence. Again, it's war. Again. It's the cycle Carl asked the show to break. And the show just keeps cycling. The evidence is overwhelming. Carl dies in Season 8, Episode 9. Rick honors Carl's vision until Season 9, Episode 5, about 1.5 seasons. And then Rick's gone, and the show immediately introduces conflicts that require violence to resolve. Whisperers in Season 9 to 10. Reapers briefly in Season 10 to 11. Commonwealth in Season 11. Every conflict is solved through warfare, through killing the leaders, defeating the antagonists, using superior violence to win. Not through Carl's methods, dialogue, cooperation, finding common ground. Through Rick's pre-Carl methods, through Shane's methods, through brutal pragmatism that says survival requires being willing to kill anyone who threatens you. And Carl asked Rick, asked the show, to prove there's another way, to prove that peace is possible, that cooperation works, that humanity can be more than just cycles of violence. And the show tried for a season and then gave up, or forgot, or decided that Carl's vision doesn't work within The Walking Dead's narrative structure, because The Walking Dead is a show about conflict, about survival through violence, about communities fighting threats. In Carl's vision, peace, cooperation, it doesn't fit that structure. It requires the show to become something else entirely, something it wasn't willing or able to become. The emotional anchor is devastating. Carl asked for peace. The show gave him one season of peace while Rick was there to enforce it, and then the show went back to violence, back to what it was before Carl died. And Carl's death, which was supposed to be transformative, catalytic, redefining, it wasn't. It was temporary. It changed things briefly, and then those changes evaporated, and Carl died for nothing. Not because people didn't care, but because the show's structure requires violence, requires villain arcs and warfare and brutal survival. And Carl's vision, beautiful as it was, hopeful as it was, it's incompatible with a show called The Walking Dead that's fundamentally about fighting to survive in a world that's trying to kill you. And the counter theory, the thing I want to hold on to, is that maybe Carl's death did plant seeds. Maybe Judith's character, her kindness, her willingness to help strangers, her belief in hope, that's Carl's legacy. Maybe RJ, Rick's son who never met Carl but grows up hearing stories about him, carries Carl's vision forward. Maybe the fragile cooperation between communities, even when they're fighting, is because Carl died asking for it and people remember even if they can't fully honor it. Maybe Carl's death matters in small ways, in character choices and community bonds, even if it doesn't transform the show's fundamental structure. And maybe that's enough. Maybe asking for a death to redefine a show is asking too much. Maybe the real impact is quieter, subtler, in the hearts of characters who loved Carl and try to be better because of him, even when they fail. And maybe that's worth something, even if it's not what Carl asked for, even if it's not what the show promised, even if it feels like Carl died for nothing. But here's the question I can't shake. Can a death matter if the show forgets it? If Carl's vision is abandoned, if Carl's name stops being mentioned, if Carl's philosophy doesn't guide decisions, if the hat sits empty on the porch and no one even looks at it, does Carl's death mean anything? Or does meaning require constant maintenance, constant remembering, constant honoring? And if meaning dies when memory fades, then Carl's death doesn't matter anymore. It mattered to Rick, it matters to Judith, but to the show, to the larger narrative of The Walking Dead, Carl's death is a footnote now. A sad episode from Season 8 that people who binge the series might barely remember. And that's the horror. Not that Carl died, but that Carl died asking the world to be better. And the world said, okay, we'll try for a bit, and then forgot and went back to being exactly what it was. And maybe that's realistic. Maybe that's how the world works. People die, we grieve, we try to honor them, and then life demands our attention and we move on, and the dead become memories, and eventually even memories fade. And meaning evaporates, and symbols become empty, and hats sit on porches gathering dust, and nobody picks them up because nobody remembers why they should. And that's Carl. That's his death. That's his legacy. A hat on a porch. Empty. Forgotten. Meaningless. And I don't know if that's the show being honest or the show failing Carl. Maybe both. Maybe it's honestly failing him. And maybe that's the saddest thing of all. Beth Green dies in Season 5, Episode 8, Coda, at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. And Beth's death is framed as meaningful, as tragic, as the loss of innocence and hope. Beth's been helping Dawn and the cops at Grady, trying to reform the system from inside, trying to save people, including Noah, a young man the cops are holding. And Beth's plan almost works. The group negotiates an exchange, Beth and Carol, who is also captured, for 2 of the Grady cops, and the exchange happens, and then Dawn demands Noah back, says Noah belongs to Grady, has to stay. And Beth, in a moment of defiance, of refusal to let Dawn keep taking people, Beth stabs Dawn with scissors, and Dawn reflexively shoots Beth in the head, and Beth dies instantly. And Daryl, watching, devastated, shoots Dawn immediately, and everything falls apart. And the show frames Beth's death as the loss of hope. Emily Kinney's performance throughout Season 5 has been about Beth maintaining optimism despite everything. Beth sings, Beth helps people, Beth believes things can get better, and Beth dies trying to save Noah, trying to prove that you can fight injustice, can stand up to authoritarians, can save people even when it costs you. And Daryl carries Beth's body out of Grady, and the group's devastated. And the emotional weight is massive. This is Beth, the girl who sang at the prison, who looked after Judith, who represented innocence in a world that kills innocence. And then, within episodes, Beth's barely mentioned again. The group grieves for maybe 2 episodes. Daryl's visibly affected. Maggie breaks down. But by Season 5's mid-season premiere, Episode 9, What Comes After, they're moving on. New threats, new conflicts, Tyrese dying. And Beth's name comes up occasionally. Maggie references her. Daryl's clearly carrying guilt, but Beth's death doesn't change anything structurally. The group doesn't learn from it, doesn't adjust behavior, doesn't honor Beth's vision of helping people and maintaining hope. They just keep doing what they were doing. Fighting, surviving, moving from place to place. And Beth's death, which was supposed to represent the loss of innocence and hope, it doesn't leave a lasting impact. It's just sad. Just another name on the list of people who died. And the meaning, the thematic weight the show tried to give it, it evaporates. And here's the thing that makes Beth's death feel particularly meaningless. Beth dies trying to save Noah, stabs Dawn to prevent Dawn from keeping Noah at Grady, and Noah escapes. Noah joins the group. Noah survives. And then Noah dies in Season 5, Episode 14, Spend, at Alexandria. 4 episodes after Beth's death, Noah gets trapped in a revolving door with Glenn and Nicholas panics and causes the door to spin, and walkers tear Noah apart while Glenn watches helplessly. And Noah's death is brutal, graphic, traumatic. But it also makes Beth's death feel pointless. Beth died saving Noah, and Noah lived for 4 episodes and then died horribly anyway. And Beth's sacrifice, her choice to stand up to Dawn, her belief that saving Noah mattered, it results in Noah dying months later in a completely unrelated incident. And what was the point? The emotional weight is that Beth's sacrifice for Noah ended up meaning nothing because Noah died shortly after anyway. And the show doesn't comment on this. Doesn't have characters reflect on the irony or the tragedy or the futility. Noah just dies, and the group grieves him briefly, and then moves on, and Beth's name barely comes up. In the meaning, the hope Beth represented, it's gone. Not honored, not remembered, just gone. And Beth becomes a footnote. A character who appeared in a few seasons, sang some songs, died trying to help someone, and then was forgotten. And the show moves on to other stories, other deaths, other conflicts. And Beth's death doesn't echo, doesn't resonate, doesn't change character, behavior, or thematic direction. It's just a death. And maybe that's honest. Most deaths don't mean anything, don't change anything, are just losses that make people sad and then life continues. But it's also devastating, because Beth deserved better. Beth's death was framed as meaningful, and the show didn't follow through, didn't maintain that meaning, Didn't let Beth's hope and innocence and sacrifice matter beyond the immediate episode. And now she's just gone. And Noah's gone. And Daryl's crossbow maintenance routine is the only remaining trace of the pain Beth's death caused. And even that fades. And eventually, by season 10 or 11, Beth's barely mentioned. Doesn't come up in conversations. Doesn't inform decisions. Doesn't matter. And that's the horror. Not that Beth died, but that Beth died meaningfully, and the meaning was discarded, thrown away, forgotten. And what does that say about the show? About how it treats death? About whether any death matters if the show won't commit to making it matter? And I don't know. But I know Beth's death feels hollow now. Feels like it should have meant more than it did. And the fact that it didn't, the fact that the show just moved on and forgot, that's almost crueler than the death itself. Because dying is one thing. Dying for nothing is another. And Beth died for nothing. Died saving someone who died 4 episodes later. Died believing her hope mattered. And it didn't. And nobody even remembers. Glenn Rhee dies in Season 7, Episode 1, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be. And it's the most devastating death in the entire series. Glenn's been there since Season 1. Glenn's the heart of the group, the moral center, the person everyone loves. Glenn saved Rick in Atlanta in the very first episode. Glenn's married to Maggie, Herschel's daughter, and Maggie's pregnant with Glenn's child. Glenn represents hope, family, the possibility that good people can survive the apocalypse. And Negan kills him, beats Glenn to death with Lucille, the barbed wire-wrapped baseball bat. And it's brutal and traumatic. And Glenn's last words are, "Maggie, I'll find you." And Glenn dies looking at Maggie, and Maggie's screaming, and it's one of the most emotionally devastating moments in television. And Glenn's death is supposed to fuel the story for years, supposed to drive Maggie's character, drive the war with Negan, drive the show's themes about loss and revenge and the cost of survival. And initially, it does. Maggie's entire Season 7 to 8 arc is about Glenn, about grieving him, about growing as a leader in his absence, about seeking justice or revenge against Negan. Maggie's conflict with Rick in Season 8's finale, when Rick spares Negan and Maggie wanted Negan dead, that's about Glenn. Maggie can't forgive Rick for letting Glenn's killer live. Can't accept mercy when her husband's murderer is still breathing. And that conflict, that pain, it drives Maggie's choices. Makes Maggie harder, more willing to make brutal calls, more focused on protecting her people even when it requires becoming something Glenn wouldn't recognize. And the show honors Glenn's memory, at least for a while. Characters mention Glenn, reference Glenn, make decisions based on what Glenn would have wanted or what Glenn's death taught them. Glenn's death represents the cost of trusting the wrong people, the danger of showing mercy to threats, the reality that good people die and sometimes there's no justice. And that weight, that meaning, it shapes Season 7 to 8, shapes the war with Negan, shapes Maggie's leadership, shapes the show's tone. But then, something shifts. Maggie leaves the show in Season 9. Lauren Cohan had contract disputes, left, came back later. And with Maggie gone, Glenn's death stops being referenced. Characters stop mentioning Glenn, stop making decisions based on Glenn's memory or Glenn's death. And by Season 10 to 11, Glenn's barely brought up. Maggie returns in Season 10's finale and Season 11, but Maggie's arc is about other things now, about leading Hilltop's survivors, about fighting the Reapers, about conflicts with the Commonwealth. Glenn's mentioned occasionally, usually in the context of Maggie explaining her past to new characters, but Glenn's not the driving force of Maggie's choices anymore. Glenn's not the thematic anchor. Glenn's just part of Maggie's backstory, a husband she lost years ago. And the meaning, the weight, the sense that Glenn's death shaped everything, that's faded. Glenn's become a name on a list of people who died, important to the people who loved him, but not important to the show anymore, not driving the narrative, not informing the themes, just gone. And here's the thing that breaks me. Even Glenn, the most beloved character, the one whose death was supposed to be the most transformative, even Glenn becomes a forgotten plot point. And that's not because fans forgot. Fans still mourn Glenn, still reference Glenn's death as one of the show's most impactful moments. But the show forgot, or the show moved on, or the show couldn't sustain Glenn's weight across 11 seasons, and Glenn's memory fades, and Maggie's arc becomes about other things. And Glenn's son, Herschel, named after Glenn's father-in-law, he grows up barely knowing his father, knowing Glenn as a story, a name, a memory Maggie shares occasionally, but not knowing Glenn as a person, as a presence, as someone whose death still matters. The pattern here is that deaths matter intensely for 2 to 3 seasons, then fade as new conflicts and characters emerge. Glenn's death drives seasons 7 to 8. Then season 9 happens. Rick leaves, Maggie leaves, and Glenn's death stops being central. And by season 10 to 11, Glenn's a memory, a reference point. A character who was important once but isn't anymore. And that's the Walking Dead structure. Deaths matter until they don't. Until new threats demand attention, new characters take focus, and the dead become backstory. Here's the question that haunts me. If you died, how long until people stopped mentioning you? Not stopped loving you, that might last forever, but stopped mentioning you. Stopped making decisions based on your memory, stopped letting your death inform their choices. A year? 3 years? 10? Because Glenn died in season 7. And by season 10, Glenn's barely mentioned. 3 seasons, 3 years of story time. And Glenn goes from the center of Maggie's world to a name she brings up occasionally when explaining her past. And if that's true for Glenn, the character everyone loved, the death that was supposed to matter most, what does that say about every other death? What does that say about how long grief lasts, how long meaning persists, how long anyone's death actually matters to anyone beyond the people who love them? And I think the answer is, not long. A few years, maybe less. And then life demands attention. New threats emerge. New people matter. And the dead become memories, and memories fade. And eventually, even Glenn, even the heart of the show, becomes just another name. Just another person who died. Just another loss in a world defined by endless loss. And maybe that's realistic. Maybe that's how grief works in a world where survival requires constant forward motion. But it's also sad, devastatingly sad, that even love, even the deepest grief, has an expiration date. That even Glenn's death, framed as the most important death in the series, stops mattering eventually. And if Glenn's death doesn't matter forever, whose does? Abraham Ford dies in the same episode as Glenn, Season 7, Episode 1, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be. Negan kills Abraham first, beats him to death with Lucille, while Abraham defies Negan with his final words, "Suck my nuts." And Abraham's death is brutal, shocking, devastating. But it's also immediately overshadowed. Because after Abraham dies, after the group's reeling from losing Abraham, Daryl punches Negan in a moment of rage, and Negan retaliates by killing Glenn. And Glenn's death is so much more devastating, so much more emotionally impactful, that Abraham's death becomes the appetizer, the warm-up, the death that happened before the death that really mattered. And that's not fair to Abraham. Abraham's been with the group since season 4. Abraham's a good man, a leader, someone trying to protect people and find purpose in the apocalypse. Abraham's relationship with Sasha, his friendship with Eugene, his role in the group, all of it matters. And Abraham dies defying Negan, refusing to show fear, going out on his own terms. That's meaningful. That's heroic in its own way. But the show doesn't give Abraham's death weight, doesn't let it breathe, doesn't let the group grieve Abraham before hitting them with Glenn's death. And Abraham's death becomes collateral. A tragedy, yes, but not the tragedy, not the death that defines the episode or the season or the war with Negan. And Abraham's loved ones grieve him, at least initially. Sasha's devastated. Rosita's grieving. Eugene's guilt-ridden, blames himself for Abraham dying because Eugene lied about knowing a cure, and Abraham died trying to help Eugene get to Washington. And that grief, that weight, it affects those characters for a few episodes. Sasha's rage fuels her choices in season 7 to 8. Rosita's anger drives her to try to kill Negan. Eugene's guilt makes him vulnerable to Negan's manipulation. But even that, even the immediate grief, it's overshadowed by Glenn, by Maggie's loss, by Herschel growing up without his father, by Glenn being the heart of the show and Abraham being supporting cast. And Abraham's death fades faster than Glenn's. Within a season, Abraham's barely mentioned. Sasha moves on emotionally, forms connections with other people, and by season 7's end, when Sasha dies, Abraham's referenced briefly, but he's not the center of her character anymore. Rosita moves on, focuses on the war, forms relationships with other people. Eugene moves on, joins the Saviors, and Abraham becomes a memory that doesn't dictate Eugene's choices. And by season 8-9-1011, Abraham's almost never mentioned. Comes up maybe once or twice across 4 seasons. And Abraham's death, which should have had weight, should have mattered because Abraham was a good person, a leader, someone trying to find meaning in survival. It doesn't. It's just a death that happened, just another name on the list, just the person who died before Glenn and therefore didn't get to be the death people remember. The emotional anchor here is that Abraham's death is treated as an appetizer to Glenn's, not a tragedy in its own right, and that's cruel. That's the show deciding that some deaths matter more than others based not on the character's value or the actor's contribution or the thematic weight, but on narrative positioning. Abraham died first in the episode, Glenn died second. And second is the one people remember. Second is the one that gets the emotional focus. And Abraham's death becomes a footnote. Oh yeah, Abraham died too, afterthought. And Abraham deserved better, deserved to have his death honored, grieved, remembered, deserved to have the show pause and let his loss matter before moving on to Glenn. But the show didn't give him that. The show used Abraham's death as setup for Glenn's. And Abraham's meaning was sacrificed so Glenn's could be amplified. And that's a choice. A narrative choice that says, this death matters, this one doesn't. And Abraham got the doesn't. And that's the horror. Not that Abraham died, but that Abraham died and the show immediately moved past him, treated his death as less important because it happened near a bigger death. And Abraham's memory fades faster than anyone's. Within months, within a season, Abraham's gone from the conversation. And Sasha and Rosita and Eugene, the people who loved him, they move on. They find new connections, new purposes, new reasons to survive. And Abraham becomes the man they used to love, past tense. Not present, not informing their choices, just a memory that occasionally gets mentioned in passing. And if that's true for Abraham, if even people who loved him stopped letting his death matter to their choices within a year, what does that say about the persistence of meaning? What does that say about whether any death actually matters beyond immediate grief? And I think the answer is sobering. Deaths matter in the moment. They devastate people. They change behavior temporarily. But then life continues. New threats emerge. New relationships form. And the dead become memories. And memories fade. And Abraham's death becomes just another death in a show full of them. And maybe some deaths matter less, not because the person mattered less, but because they happen at the wrong time, in the wrong context, overshadowed by something bigger. And that's not fair. But it's how storytelling works. And it's maybe how life works, too. Some losses get mourned, some get overlooked. And whether your death matters often depends on circumstances beyond your control. What else is happening? Who else is dying? Whether anyone has the bandwidth to grieve you fully before the next tragedy hits. And Abraham didn't get that bandwidth, didn't get the space to be mourned before Glenn's death took all the oxygen. And Abraham's death stops mattering because it never got the chance to matter fully in the first place. And that's tragic and unfair. And maybe the most honest thing The Walking Dead's ever shown us about death. So let's talk about why this happens. Why Carl's death stops mattering. Why Glenn's memory fades. Why Abraham's death never gets weight. Why Beth's sacrifice feels meaningless. And I think the answer, at least partially, is about production logistics versus story needs. Because deaths in The Walking Dead often aren't driven by what the story needs. They're driven by actor contracts, by availability, by people wanting to leave or the show deciding it's time for a character to go. And when deaths are driven by real-world logistics rather than narrative planning, they can't be honored long-term because the show didn't plan for them, didn't build toward them, didn't structure future seasons around them. They just happened, and the show has to react. And sometimes the show reacts well, honors the death, builds storylines around it, makes it matter. But often the show just moves on, because the death wasn't supposed to happen at that moment, wasn't part of a long-term plan, and the show doesn't know how to sustain its meaning. Carl's death is the clearest example. Chandler Riggs, the actor who played Carl, turned 18 during Season 8. And there were conflicts between Riggs and the showrunners about Carl's future. Some reports suggest Riggs wanted to leave, wanted to pursue other opportunities. Other reports suggest the show decided to kill Carl for shock value, to raise stakes during the Negan War. But regardless of the specific reasons, Carl's death wasn't planned years in advance. It wasn't a culmination of Carl's arc. It was a decision made during Season 8, and the show had to figure out what Carl's death meant after the fact. And the show decided, Carl's death means Rick spares Negan, creates peace, honors Carl's vision, and that works for a season. But then Andrew Lincoln, the actor who plays Rick, decides to leave, and suddenly the show loses the character most invested in honoring Carl's memory. And Carl's death can't matter anymore because the person carrying its weight is gone, and the show doesn't know how to transfer that weight to other characters, so it just fades. And Carl's death stops mattering not because it wasn't important, but because it wasn't planned long-term and the show couldn't sustain it once Rick left. The same is true for Glenn, Maggie, and others. Glenn's death was planned. It's from the comics. It's a major plot point. But Lauren Cohan's contract negotiations and her leaving the show in Season 9, that wasn't planned. And Maggie's the character most affected by Glenn's death. And when Maggie leaves, Glenn's death loses its primary vessel. And the show doesn't know how to make Glenn matter to other characters in the same way. Daryl doesn't carry Glenn's weight. Carol doesn't. They have their own traumas, their own losses. And Glenn becomes Maggie's loss. And when Maggie's gone, Glenn's death fades. And when Maggie returns in Season 10 to 11, her arc's about other things because the show's moved on. And Glenn's death can't be resurrected as a driving force because too much time has passed and the story's in a different place. And this pattern, deaths driven by production needs, not story needs, it means deaths can't matter long term. Because the show's reacting to actor availability, to contract negotiations, to behind-the-scenes logistics, not planning story arcs that honor deaths for seasons. And reactive storytelling, by nature, is shorter term. The show honors a death for a season, maybe 2, and then moves on because it has to, because new actors are leaving, New contracts are expiring, new logistical challenges are emerging, and the show's constantly reacting, and deaths become plot points, catalysts for short-term arcs, not long-term thematic anchors. The emotional weight here is that deaths can't matter long-term if they weren't planned long-term. And most deaths in The Walking Dead weren't planned years in advance. They were decisions made for production reasons. Actor wants to leave, contract expires, show wants shock value. And those deaths, driven by logistics rather than narrative necessity, they can't be sustained, can't be honored beyond immediate aftermath. Because the show didn't build infrastructure to support them, didn't plan future storylines around them, didn't structure character arcs to carry their weight for seasons. And deaths that aren't planned, deaths that happen for logistical reasons, they fade. They stop mattering. They become trivia. Remember when Carl died? Remember when Glenn died? Yes. But does their death inform current storylines? No, not really. Not anymore. And that's the consequence of production-driven storytelling. Deaths happen. They're impactful in the moment. And then the show moves on because it doesn't have a choice. Because the logistics that caused the death in the first place, actor leaving, contract ending those logistics, keep creating new problems that demand attention, and the dead become memories. And memories don't drive stories. Living characters drive stories. And living characters are dealing with new crises, new logistics, new behind-the-scenes realities. And the dead get left behind. And that's television. That's the reality of making a show that runs for 11 seasons with actors who have lives and careers outside the show. Deaths happen for reasons that have nothing to do with story, and stories have to react. And sometimes the reaction is powerful and meaningful, and sometimes it's just moving on. And Carl and Glenn and Abraham and Beth, they all got moved on from. And maybe that's honest. Maybe that's showing us that death in the real world doesn't follow narrative arcs. People die when they die. For logistical reasons, for random reasons, for reasons that don't make sense. And the living have to react, have to figure out what it means, have to honor the dead or not, depending on whether they have the bandwidth and the infrastructure. And The Walking Dead, the show, it's living that reality. Deaths happen. The show reacts. And sometimes the reaction is honoring the death for seasons. And sometimes it's moving on within episodes. And we don't get to choose. And neither does the show. And maybe that's the most honest thing about all of this. That meaning isn't guaranteed. That deaths don't automatically matter. That logistics, real world, behind-the-scenes logistics, they kill story, meaning just as surely as they kill characters. And we're left wondering what it was all for. And often the answer is nothing. It was for nothing. Because the world, the show, the logistics, they don't care about meaning. They just care about continuing. And the dead, they can't continue. So they stop mattering. And that's brutal and honest and sad. The Walking Dead has a structure, a format, that it follows pretty consistently across 11 seasons. Introduce a villain, fight the villain, defeat the villain, introduce new villain, the governor, terminus, the saviors, the whisperers, the reapers, the commonwealth. Every season or multi-season arc follows this pattern. And that structure, that requirement for constant conflict, it makes deaths that argue for peace narratively impotent. Because Carl's death in Season 8 asks the show to break the cycle, to stop fighting villains and start building peace. And the show can't do that. Not structurally. Because a show called The Walking Dead about survival in the apocalypse requires threats, requires conflict, requires villains to fight. And Carl's asking the show to become something it's not, to become a show about rebuilding civilization peacefully. And that's not The Walking Dead. That's a different show. And I think the show knew that. I think the writers knew that Carl's vision stopped the violence, build something better, honor humanity. It's incompatible with the show's DNA. But they killed Carl anyway. Let Carl ask for peace. Let Carl die, believing peace was possible. And then the show gave peace one season, season 9, while Rick was there to enforce it, and then immediately went back to the villain arc structure, introduced the Whisperers, made them the new threat, required the communities to band together and fight, and the cycle continued. And Carl's vision died, not because it wasn't beautiful or hopeful, but because it didn't fit the show's format. And the show's format is what keeps the show running, what keeps viewers engaged, what creates drama and stakes and reasons to tune in every week. The evidence is undeniable. Season 8 ends with peace. Carl's asked for it. Rick's honored it. Negan's imprisoned instead of killed. And Season 9, Episode 6, introduces Alpha and the Whisperers. New villain, new threat, new arc. And Season 9 to 10 is the Whisperer War. Season 10 to 11 is the Commonwealth conflict. The show never stops having villain arcs, never stops requiring communities to fight threats, never becomes the peaceful rebuilding show Carl asked for, because that show wouldn't have the same tension, the same stakes, the same drama. That show would be about farming and trade negotiations and slow community building, and that's not what The Walking Dead is. The Walking Dead is about survival through violence, about fighting threats, about the constant danger of the apocalypse. And Carl's vision, peaceful and hopeful, it requires the show to stop being itself. And the show can't do that, won't do that. Tried for one season and then went back to what works. What keeps people watching? What creates the drama and stakes that the show's built on? And Carl's not the only character who dies asking for something the show's format won't allow. Dale dies in Season 2, arguing for mercy, for maintaining pre-outbreak morality. And the show immediately proves Dale wrong by having the barn massacre, by showing that mercy gets you killed. Herschel dies in Season 4, believing in hope and faith and goodness. And the governor executes him in front of everyone, proving that hope is weakness in the apocalypse. Beth dies in Season 5 trying to help people and maintain innocence, and the show kills her and moves on, showing that innocence doesn't survive. Every character who dies arguing for a different kind of show, a show about peace or mercy or hope, they're proven wrong by the show's continued existence as a show about violence. And Carl's just the biggest, most explicit example. Carl dies asking the show to change. And the show says, we'll try for a season, and then goes back to what it was. And Carl's vision becomes impossible not because it's wrong, but because it's incompatible with The Walking Dead's fundamental format. The emotional anchor is heartbreaking. Carl's vision was impossible. The show he wanted, the show he died asking for, it couldn't exist. Not as The Walking Dead. Maybe as a spin-off, a sequel, a different series about rebuilding civilization peacefully, but not as The Walking Dead proper. And Carl died believing his vision could be realized. Died asking Rick to make it happen. And Rick tried. Rick honored Carl for as long as Rick could. But Rick left. And the show continued. And the show's continuation required going back to the villain arc format. Required the Whisperers, the Reapers, the Commonwealth. Required constant conflict. And Carl's vision, peaceful and beautiful, it died when the show decided it needed drama more than it needed to honor Carl. Here's the question that keeps me awake. Can a show about violence honor deaths that reject violence? Can The Walking Dead, fundamentally a series about survival through brutality, honor characters who die asking for peace? And I think the answer is no. Not long-term, not structurally. The show can honor them for episodes, maybe a season, can let their deaths create temporary change, but the show's format requires going back to violence. Requires villain arcs, and warfare, and brutal survival. And deaths that argue against that format They can't be sustained. They're beautiful. They're meaningful in the moment. But they're incompatible with what the show is. And the show will always choose its own survival over honoring characters who ask it to be different. And maybe that's okay. Maybe shows should be what they are, not what characters want them to be. But it's also sad, because Carl deserved better, deserved to have his vision honored, deserved to have the show become what he asked for. But the show couldn't, and Carl died for a vision that was never going to be realized. And that's the tragedy. Not that Carl died, but that Carl died asking for something impossible. And the show let him believe it was possible, let him die with hope, and then abandon that hope the moment it became inconvenient. And Carl's hat sits on the porch, empty, because Carl's vision is empty, was always empty, was never going to be filled. And maybe Carl knew that. Maybe Carl died knowing his vision was impossible, but asking for it anyway. And maybe that's the real heroism, not dying for something achievable, but dying for something impossible because it's worth dying for, even if it'll never happen. And maybe that's Carl, and maybe that's enough, even though it didn't change anything, even though the show forgot, even though the vision died with him. Maybe dying for impossible things is the only heroism the apocalypse allows. And maybe Carl's death matters even though it didn't change the show, because Carl tried, and trying matters, even when it fails, even when it's forgotten, even when the hat sits empty. Here's something I've noticed watching The Walking Dead across 11 seasons. Characters grieve deaths intensely for 2 to 3 episodes, then rarely mention them again. And that's not because the characters stop caring. It's because survival doesn't allow extended mourning. The apocalypse keeps moving. New threats keep emerging. And the living have to keep fighting, keep planning, keep surviving. And grief, real grief, the kind that makes you unable to function, the kind that requires time and space and the ability to just sit with loss, that's a luxury characters can't afford. So they grieve quickly, intensely, for a few episodes. And then they push it down, lock it away, and keep moving. Because if they don't, they die. And the show reflects that. Shows intense grief immediately after a death. Shows characters breaking down, making rash decisions, being unable to function, and then shows them recovering, getting back to survival, mentioning the dead occasionally but not being defined by them anymore. And that's realistic. That's probably how grief works in actual survival situations. You don't get months to mourn. You get days, maybe. And then life demands you keep going. Keep protecting people. Keep making decisions. Keep surviving. And your grief becomes something you carry privately, something you deal with in quiet moments, something that informs your choices but doesn't paralyze you. And the show, to its credit, shows that. Shows Rick hallucinating Lori for episodes after she dies, then gradually letting her go. Shows Maggie devastated by Glenn's death, then gradually building a life without him. Shows Daryl carrying Beth's loss, then gradually finding new purposes. The grief doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable, becomes something characters live with rather than something that stops them from living. But here's where it gets complicated. The show's pacing doesn't allow for sustained grief, not just the characters' lives, the show itself, because The Walking Dead moves fast. Episodes cover days or weeks, seasons cover months or years, and if the show spent multiple episodes on characters grieving, the story would slow to a crawl, the drama would stall, the stakes would feel less urgent. So the show compresses grief, makes it intense and immediate, and then moves on. And that compression, that rapid movement from grief to recovery, it makes deaths feel less impactful over time, makes them feel like they matter less than they should. Because we see characters devastated, and then 3 episodes later they're functional again, and it feels too fast. Feels like the show's not honoring the dead. not letting grief last as long as it should. The evidence is everywhere. Maggie stops talking about Glenn by season 9. Rick stops hallucinating Lori by season 4. Daryl stops visibly grieving Beth by season 6. Carol stops mentioning Sophia and Lizzie by seasons 6 to 7. Every major death, every major loss, it's grieved intensely for a few episodes, and then the show moves on. And characters mention the dead occasionally, usually when introducing themselves to new people, as part of backstory explanation, but the dead stop driving behavior, stop informing decisions, stop being present in the characters' emotional lives. And that's because survival requires moving forward, requires not being paralyzed by loss, requires functioning despite grief. And the show, structurally, requires pacing, requires moving from conflict to conflict, threat to threat, without pausing for extended mourning. And here's the emotional weight. Deaths stop mattering because living characters can't afford to remember. Not constantly, not in ways that affect daily survival. They remember in quiet moments, in private grief, in decisions that feel informed by loss, even if the dead person's name isn't mentioned. But they don't talk about the dead constantly. Don't make explicit references. Don't let grief slow them down, because grief is a liability in the apocalypse, makes you vulnerable, makes you distracted, makes you unable to react fast enough when threats emerge. And threats always emerge, so characters grieve quickly and move on, and the show reflects that. And deaths fade from conversation, fade from explicit reference, become part of the background, the weight characters carry but don't discuss. And maybe that's honest. Maybe that's how real grief works in extreme circumstances. You don't get to mourn forever. You mourn fast and hard, and then you keep living because life doesn't pause for your grief. But it's also sad. It's also a structural reality that makes deaths feel meaningless over time. Because if characters stop mentioning the dead, stop being visibly affected by their loss, we as viewers start to feel like the deaths didn't matter, like the show's forgotten, like the characters have moved on too completely. And maybe they haven't. Maybe the grief is still there, private and quiet, but we don't see it. And what we don't see, we start to doubt exists, and deaths become footnotes, names on a list, people who died and were mourned briefly and then forgotten by the show's narrative, even if not by the characters' hearts. And that gap, that disconnect between what characters might feel privately and what the show shows us, it makes deaths feel hollow, makes them feel like they stopped mattering. And maybe they didn't. Maybe they matter privately, quietly, in ways we don't see. But if the show doesn't show it, if the show doesn't make us feel it, then functionally, for us as viewers, the death stops mattering. And that's The Walking Dead's grief structure. Fast, intense, then gone from view. And deaths become memories. And memories fade. And eventually, even the biggest deaths, Carl, Glenn, Herschel, they become names, characters, mentioned occasionally but don't dwell on. And the show moves forward, and the dead get left behind. And maybe that's survival. And maybe that's honest. But it's also the reason deaths stop mattering. Because the show can't pause, can't let grief last, can't honor the dead beyond a few episodes before the next threat demands attention. And the dead become collateral, not to cruelty, to necessity, to the structural demands of telling a story about survival in a world that never stops trying to kill you. And that's sad and realistic. And maybe the most honest thing the show does, even if it makes deaths feel meaningless. But here's the thing. Some deaths do matter. Some deaths change protagonist behavior long-term and stay relevant across seasons. And understanding which deaths matter and why, that tells us something about what makes death meaningful in The Walking Dead's world. Because it's not random. It's not arbitrary. There's a pattern. And the pattern is, deaths matter when they change protagonist behavior long term. When a surviving protagonist carries the dead person's weight and won't let them be forgotten. Lori's death, in Season 3, Episode 4, Killer Within, defines Rick for seasons. Rick hallucinates Lori in Season 3. Rick talks to Lori on a phantom phone. Rick makes decisions based on what Lori would have wanted, what Lori's death taught him about the cost of survival. And Lori's death isn't just grief, it's transformation. It's Rick becoming harder, more willing to make brutal calls, more isolated from the group, and that transformation lasts. Rick's Season 3 to 4 arc is about Lori, about learning to live without her, learning to be both mother and father to Carl and Judith, learning to lead while carrying the weight of having lost the person he loved most. And Lori's death matters because Rick won't let it not matter. Rick carries Lori's weight across seasons, and we see it, we feel it. And Lori's death stays relevant because Rick keeps it relevant. Herschel's death in Season 4, Episode 8, Too Far Gone, motivates everyone for seasons. The governor executes Herschel with Michonne's katana in front of everyone, and Herschel's death becomes the moral anchor the group returns to repeatedly. Characters quote Herschel, reference Herschel's faith, Herschel's hope, Herschel's belief that people can be better. Maggie, Beth, and later Judith all carry Herschel's legacy. And Herschel's death matters because multiple characters won't let him be forgotten. Keep invoking his name, his wisdom, his example. And Herschel stays present in the narrative, stays relevant to character decisions, stays meaningful because the living make him meaningful. And Carl's death in Season 8 drives Rick through Season 9. Rick carries Carl's letters. Rick quotes Carl. Rick makes peace with Negan because Carl asked him to. Rick builds the bridge because Carl believed in cooperation. Rick sacrifices himself on that bridge because Carl's vision of selfless heroism is what Rick's trying to embody. And Carl's death matters as long as Rick's there to carry it, as long as Rick's making decisions explicitly tied to Carl's memory. And when Rick leaves, Carl's meaning fades. But while Rick's there, Carl matters immensely, because Rick won't let Carl be forgotten. The pattern is clear. Deaths matter as long as someone alive makes them matter. As long as a protagonist, someone we're following, someone whose decisions we're watching, carries the dead person's weight and makes choices based on their memory. And when that protagonist leaves or stops referencing the dead person, the death stops mattering to the show. Not because the death was unimportant, but because meaning requires maintenance. Requires someone actively remembering, honoring, being changed by the loss. And when that stops, when the person carrying the weight is gone or has moved on, the death fades, becomes history. Becomes a name mentioned occasionally, but not a force shaping current decisions. And here's the question that's been haunting this entire exploration. Does death meaning require living people to maintain it? And I think the answer is yes. Unequivocally yes. Death doesn't inherently mean anything. Death is just loss, just absence, just the end of a life. And meaning the sense that a death mattered, that it changed things, that it should be remembered. That's something living people create. Living people decide a death means something. Living people honor the dead by letting their loss inform behavior. And when living people stop doing that, stop remembering, stop being changed, stop making decisions based on the dead person's memory, the death stops meaning anything, becomes just another death, just another name on a long list. And that's not the dead person's fault. The dead can't maintain their own meaning, can't force the living to remember them, can only hope that the people who love them will carry their weight forward. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, death becomes meaningless. Not because it wasn't tragic, but because tragedy without remembrance is just loss, just absence, just nothing. And The Walking Dead shows us both. Shows us deaths that matter because characters like Rick and Maggie and Michonne carry them forward. And shows us deaths that fade because no one carries them. Because the person who would have carried them left the show, or moved on emotionally, or got overwhelmed by new losses. And both are realistic. Both happen in real life. Some losses we carry forever. Some we carry for years and then gradually let go. Some we barely carry at all because life demands too much and we don't have the capacity, and The Walking Dead doesn't judge that. Doesn't say it's wrong to let go of grief, just shows that when we do, the dead fade, and their deaths stop mattering to anyone except maybe us, privately, in moments we don't share. And functionally, for the story, for the show, for the viewers, those deaths become meaningless. Not because they were never meaningful, but because meaning wasn't maintained. And maintenance is what makes meaning last. And sometimes we can't maintain it, and sometimes we choose not to. And either way, the dead fade, and that's the horror. Not that people die, but that people die and are forgotten, that meaning evaporates. That even the deaths that should matter forever, Carl, Glenn, Herschel, they stop mattering eventually because the living move on, have to move on, and the dead become memories, and memories fade, and eventually, even the most important deaths become just names, just losses, just absences that nobody fills. And maybe that's life, and maybe that's honest, but it's also the saddest thing I can think of, that even love has an expiration date, that even grief fades, that even the dead we swore we'd never forget, we forget, not completely, but enough that they stop mattering, stop driving us, stop being present, and they're gone, truly gone. Not just physically, but meaningfully. And that's death, real death, not the body stopping, but the meaning stopping. And The Walking Dead shows us both, and asks us to sit with how sad that is, and maybe to try harder to remember, to carry the dead forward, to make their deaths matter by refusing to let them fade, and maybe that's all we can do. Remember, honor, carry, and hope it's enough. So let's be honest about what The Walking Dead is. A television show that needs death for drama. Death creates stakes, creates emotion, creates water cooler moments that get people talking. And The Walking Dead uses death effectively, uses it to shock viewers, to raise stakes, to make us feel like no one's safe. And that's good TV. That's engaging storytelling. But it also means the show can't honor all deaths equally, can't give every death the weight it deserves. Because if every death got episodes of mourning, seasons of character transformation, constant references and callbacks, the show would grind to a halt. The story would become about grief instead of about survival. And that's not The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead is about moving forward despite loss, about surviving even when people you love die. And that requires the show to treat some deaths as more important than others. And the pattern is clear. Protagonist-adjacent deaths maintain meaning. Supporting character deaths become plot devices. Carl's death matters because Carl's Rick's son. Glenn's death matters because Glenn's married to Maggie, a main character. Herschel's death matters because Herschel's a moral anchor for multiple protagonists. Laurie's death matters because Laurie's Rick's wife. These deaths happen to people close to the protagonists we're following. And proximity to protagonists determines narrative weight, determines how long a death matters, how often it's referenced, how much it changes the story. But supporting character deaths? Beth, Abraham, Sasha, Tyrese, Dale, T-Dog, Countless others? They die, they're mourned briefly, and then the show moves on. Not because those characters were less valuable or less loved, but because they weren't protagonist adjacent in the right way, weren't connected closely enough to the characters we're following most intensely, and their deaths become plot points, catalysts for short-term emotional arcs, moments that create stakes and tension, but not long-term meaning, not transformation, just loss, just sadness, just names on a list. And here's the brutal truth. The Walking Dead can't give every death weight without the show grinding to a halt. If the show honored Beth's death for seasons, honored Abraham's death, honored every death that happened, the show would become unwatchable, would be constant mourning, constant grief, constant references to the dead. And that's not sustainable. Not for a show that runs 11 seasons. Not for a show that kills dozens of named characters. The show has to pick which deaths matter and which don't. Has to prioritize. Has to make brutal choices about which losses get narrative weight and which get treated as collateral. And those choices, those priorities, they're not always fair, aren't based on which character deserved to be remembered most. They're based on story economics. On which deaths serve the narrative, on which losses create the most drama with the least narrative cost. And Carl matters more than Beth because Carl's Rick's son. Glenn matters more than Abraham because Glenn's death can drive Maggie's arc for seasons. Herschel matters because he's connected to multiple protagonists. And Beth, Abraham, Sasha, they matter less. Not because they were less important as people, but because their deaths don't drive protagonist arcs as effectively, don't create as much long-term narrative value, and the show makes the economical choice, honors them briefly, moves on quickly, and treats their deaths as supporting moments in other characters' stories rather than as defining moments in their own right. And that's television. That's story economics. That's the reality of making a show that needs constant drama, constant forward momentum, constant engagement. You can't pause for every death, can't give every loss the weight it deserves. You have to prioritize, have to make choices, have to decide which deaths matter and which are just plot points. And The Walking Dead makes those choices constantly. And some characters get meaning, and some don't. And it's not fair. But it's necessary. And maybe that's the most honest thing about all of this. That fairness isn't a factor. That meaning is allocated based on utility, not desert. That deaths matter when they serve the story and don't when they don't. And that's cold and brutal and exactly how survival works. You save who you can. You mourn who you have bandwidth for. You let the rest fade because you don't have a choice. And The Walking Dead, the show, it's surviving too. Surviving the demands of being an 11-season series that needs constant drama. And deaths are tools. Some tools get used extensively. Some get used once and discarded. And which category your death falls into, that's not about you. That's about what the story needs. And the story needs Carl more than it needs Beth. Needs Glenn more than it needs Abraham. Needs protagonists' losses more than it needs supporting characters' losses. And that allocation of meaning, that prioritization, it's brutal. But it's also necessary. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that some deaths don't matter, but that we accept that they don't. That we understand why the show can't honor everyone. And we move on too, just like the show does, just like the characters do. Because life and television, they both require moving forward. And the dead, they can't come with us. Some of them we carry, and some of them we leave behind. And that's how meaning works. And that's how grief works. And that's how survival works. And The Walking Dead shows us all of it, and asks us to sit with how unfair it is, and to accept it anyway, because what else can we do? So, what does Carl's death say about The Walking Dead? What does it mean that the show killed its second most important character, framed his death as transformative and redemptive, and then abandoned his vision within 2 seasons? And I think the answer is uncomfortable but important. The Walking Dead is unable to honor Carl's vision because the show's format requires Carl's vision's opposite. Carl asks for peace. The show requires violence. Carl asks for hope. The show requires despair. Carl asks for cooperation and building. The show requires conflict and destruction, and those aren't compatible. Carl's vision and The Walking Dead's DNA, they're opposites. And the show can pretend to honor Carl for a season, can let Rick try to build peace, try to unite communities, try to be the father Carl asked him to be. But the show can't sustain it, can't become what Carl asked for, because that would require The Walking Dead to stop being The Walking Dead. And shows don't do that. Shows can't do that. They are what they are. And The Walking Dead is a show about survival through violence, about fighting threats, about brutal pragmatism. And Carl died asking it to be different, and the show couldn't be. And Carl's death becomes meaningless not because the show didn't care, but because the show couldn't honor Carl without ceasing to be itself. And there's evidence for this everywhere. Season 9 tries to honor Carl, tries to show peace, cooperation, bridge building, and it's the lowest rated season in years. Viewership drops. Engagement drops. People stop watching because The Walking Dead without constant threats, without villain arcs, without warfare, it's not what people signed up for. People watch The Walking Dead for the tension, the danger, the drama of survival, not for episodes about building bridges and negotiating trade agreements. And the show knows this. Knows that Carl's vision, while beautiful, doesn't make for engaging television in The Walking Dead's format. So the show abandons it, introduces the Whisperers, goes back to violence, and viewership stabilizes. People come back, because The Walking Dead being The Walking Dead is what viewers want. And Carl's vision, peaceful and hopeful, it's not what The Walking Dead is. It's not what viewers are here for. And the show chooses survival, its own survival as a successful series over honoring Carl. And maybe that's the right choice. Maybe shows should be what they are, what viewers want, what works. But it's also sad. Because Carl deserved better. Deserved to have his death mean something. Deserved to have the show become what he asked for. But the show couldn't. Because becoming what Carl asked for would mean alienating viewers, losing ratings, potentially being canceled. And shows choose survival, just like characters do. And Carl's vision is sacrificed so The Walking Dead can continue. And that's brutal and honest. And maybe the most Walking Dead thing the show's ever done. Sacrificing idealism for survival, choosing what works over what's right, becoming what you have to be to stay alive. And Carl asked the show not to. And the show tried for a season, and then chose survival anyway. And Carl's death becomes the ultimate proof that The Walking Dead can't change, can't be better, can only be what it's always been. A show about survival through violence, and deaths that argue for anything else. Their beautiful moments, touching episodes, emotional arcs. But they don't last, can't last, because the show's survival requires them not to. But here's the counter theory, the one I want to believe even if it's not entirely supported. Maybe Carl's death did plant seeds. Maybe Judith's character, her kindness, her compassion, her willingness to help strangers and believe in hope, that's Carl's legacy. Maybe RJ growing up hearing stories about the brother he never met, stories about Carl's bravery and Carl's vision, maybe that's Carl's meaning persisting. Maybe the fragile alliances between communities, The fact that Alexandria and Hilltop and the kingdom tried to cooperate even when it was hard. Maybe that's because Carl died asking for it, and people remember, even if they can't fully honor it. Maybe Carl's death didn't transform the show, but it did transform characters. Did make them slightly better, slightly more hopeful, slightly more willing to try peace before resorting to violence. And maybe that's enough. Maybe asking for a death to redefine a show's entire format is asking too much. Maybe the real impact is quieter, in character choices, in moments of mercy, in decisions to help someone when it would be easier not to. And maybe Judith helping strangers, maybe communities cooperating even briefly. Maybe those are Carl's victories. Small victories, insufficient victories, but victories nonetheless. And here's the question I keep coming back to. Is a death meaningful if it changes things temporarily, even if the change doesn't last? Because Carl's death changed Rick, changed the show for a season, created peace that lasted a year. And then the peace ended, and the violence returned, and Carl's vision faded. But for that year, for that season, it mattered. Rick was different. The communities tried, and even though it didn't last, even though the show went back to violence, does that year count? Does that temporary transformation have meaning? Or does meaning require permanence? Does a death only matter if its impact lasts forever? And I don't know the answer. Part of me says yes, temporary change is still change, still meaningful. Carl's death made Rick better for a year, made the show try something different, and that's worth something, even if it didn't last. But part of me says no, if the change is temporary, if it evaporates, then it didn't really change anything. It just paused things. And once the pause ended, everything went back to how it was. And Carl died for a pause. Not a transformation. A temporary halt in the violence before the violence resumed. And is that meaningful? Is dying for a temporary pause worth it? And I honestly don't know. But I know Carl thought it was. Thought trying for peace, even if it failed, was worth dying for. And maybe Carl was right. Maybe trying is enough. Maybe asking for the impossible and getting a brief glimpse of it before it fades, maybe that's all we can hope for. Maybe Carl's death meant something, even though it didn't change the show forever. Because it changed Rick. And Rick, for a year, tried to be better. And that's something. And maybe that's all death can ever mean. Changing the people who loved you for a while, before they move on, before they forget, before life demands they be something else. And Carl changed Rick. And that mattered. For a year. And then Rick left. And Carl's meaning left with him. And maybe that's all any of us get. Temporary impact. Brief meaning. A moment where we mattered before the world moved on. And maybe that's enough. Or maybe it's not. But it's all we have. And Carl took it. And tried. And hoped. And died believing it would matter. And it did. For a year. And then it didn't. And that's The Walking Dead. And that's life. And that's the empty hat on the porch. And maybe understanding that is all we can do. Here's the truth. I've been dancing around for 10,000 words. Most deaths don't change anything. Not really. Not permanently. People die. The world grieves briefly. And then the world continues. And the dead become memories. And memories fade. And life goes on without them. And that's not because we don't love them. Not because their lives didn't matter. But because the world is too big, too relentless, too demanding to pause for anyone's death. And The Walking Dead, to its credit, shows us that. Shows us that even Carl, even Glenn, even the deaths that should matter most, they stop mattering. Not immediately, not cruelly, but gradually, inevitably, as new threats emerge and living people have to focus on surviving rather than remembering. And that's brutally realistic. That's more honest than most shows would dare to be, because most shows treat death as transformative, as permanently changing characters and storylines. But The Walking Dead shows us that transformation is temporary, that change fades, that even the deaths that reshape everything, they only reshape things for a while before the world reshapes itself back. Carl wanted his death to end the war with Negan, wanted his death to create lasting peace, wanted to prove that humanity could survive without constant violence, and his death did end the war, did create peace. For a year. And then the Whisperers came, and the war started again, and Carl's vision evaporated, and the world continued being exactly what it was before Carl died. Violent, brutal, unforgiving. And Carl's death didn't change that, didn't create lasting transformation, just created a brief pause, a year of peace and a decade of violence, and then the violence resumed. And Carl's death becomes just another death, just another loss, just another person who believed things could be better and died before the world proved them wrong. Beth wanted to save Noah, wanted to prove you could stand up to authoritarians and rescue people and make things better. And Beth died saving Noah. And Noah lived for 4 episodes and died anyway. And Beth's sacrifice accomplished nothing lasting. Saved Noah temporarily, but Noah died regardless, and Beth's death becomes pointless, not because Beth wasn't brave or noble, but because the world continued being hostile and unforgiving, and Noah died anyway, and Beth's sacrifice didn't prevent that, just delayed it. Abraham died for nothing. Didn't die for a cause or a person or a reason, just died because Negan needed to kill someone to make a point. And Abraham's death, brave as it was, defiant as it was, it doesn't mean anything beyond that moment, doesn't change anything, doesn't transform anyone, just ends Abraham's life. And Abraham becomes a name, a person who died, and the world moves on. And Abraham's death matters to Sasha and Rosita for a while, and then they move on too. And Abraham's forgotten, and his death, meaningless. And here's the brutal honesty. The Walking Dead's willingness to let deaths become meaningless is realistic. Most real deaths don't change anything, don't transform the world, don't create lasting meaning. They just end lives, and the world continues, and the living grieve and move on, and the dead become memories, and memories fade. And eventually, even the people we swore we'd never forget, we forget. Not completely, but enough. Enough that they stop driving our choices, stop being present in our daily thoughts, stop mattering the way they mattered when they were alive. And that's not cruelty. That's not callousness. That's life. That's how grief works. Intensely at first, then gradually fading as new demands emerge, and living requires moving forward rather than dwelling on loss. And The Walking Dead shows us that. Shows us characters grieving intensely and then moving on. Shows us deaths that are framed as transformative and then aren't. Shows us that most deaths, even deaths of beloved characters, even deaths that should matter forever, they stop mattering. And that's honest. That's more honest than pretending every death changes everything forever. Because they don't. Most deaths change things temporarily, and then the change fades, and the world returns to being what it was, and the dead become names, and names fade, and eventually even the deaths that seemed most important become just entries in a list of losses, just people who died. Just absences nobody fills. And that's real. That's what actual grief is. Not permanent transformation. Temporary devastation followed by gradual recovery, followed by moving on. And the dead get left behind, and that's sad and real. And maybe that's what The Walking Dead has been showing us all along. The emotional anchor is that real grief is people being forgotten, life continuing without them, meaning evaporating. And The Walking Dead doesn't shy away from that. doesn't pretend that deaths maintain meaning forever, shows us that meaning fades, shows us that even Carl, even Glenn, even the characters we loved most, they stop being central to the story, stop being mentioned regularly, stop mattering to current conflicts, and they become history, become part of characters' pasts rather than their presents. And that's brutal, but it's honest. It's showing us what death actually is. Not transformation, not meaning, just loss, just absence, just people being gone and the world continuing without them, and gradually forgetting them, not cruelly, not intentionally, but inevitably, because the living have to keep living, and living requires moving forward, and the dead can't come with us, so they fade, and their deaths stop mattering. And maybe that's the real horror, not that people die, but that people die and the world doesn't care, continues without them, forgets them, and their deaths, which felt so important, so devastating, so transformative in the moment, they become nothing, just another death in a world full of them, just another name, just another loss that used to hurt and now barely registers. And Carl's hat sits on the porch, and nobody picks it up, because nobody remembers why it mattered, and that's death, real death. Not the body stopping, but the meaning stopping, the memory fading, the world moving on, and The Walking Dead shows us that, and asks us, does death need to mean something? Or is meaning something we impose on death to make it bearable? And maybe it's the latter. Maybe deaths don't inherently mean anything. Maybe we create meaning, decide deaths matter, choose to remember, to honor, to let loss transform us. And when we stop doing that, stop remembering, stop honoring, stop being transformed, the death stops meaning anything, becomes just loss, just absence, just nothing. And Carl's death is nothing now. Was something for a year, and now it's nothing. And maybe that's okay. Maybe deaths don't need to mean something forever. Maybe mattering temporarily is enough, or maybe it's not. Maybe Carl deserved better, but the world, the show, they didn't give it to him, and Carl's hat blows off the porch. And nobody notices. And that's The Walking Dead, and that's life. And that's the answer to whether deaths mean anything, sometimes, temporarily, and then they don't, and we move on. And that's all there is. Thanks for staying with me through this one. If this got you thinking about grief, about memory, about whether the deaths we mourn actually change anything in the long run, I'd really appreciate a like. It helps these late-night explorations reach other people who can't stop wondering about the weight of loss. And drop your location in the comments. I'm curious where you're watching from. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, lying in the dark, thinking about the same sad truth, that even the deaths that should matter forever eventually fade. Sleep well, and remember Carl's hat sits empty on that porch, not because nobody loved Carl, but because the world moved on. Because survival demands moving forward. Because grief, real grief, it has an expiration date whether we want it to or not. Maybe Carl's death meant something. For a year. For Rick. For the brief moment when peace seemed possible. Or maybe it meant nothing at all. And honestly, both are true, and both are heartbreaking. Sweet dreams. And maybe, just maybe, think about the people you've lost and whether you're still carrying them or whether you've moved on too, because we all do, eventually. And that's the real horror, not that people die, but that we forget them and keep living anyway.